I think this is just going to be a rather informal debate or discussion on. I think feminism is something that we're going to start with because I suspect we have very different views on feminism, although we don't really know too much about each other. So not sure how this is going to go. So I'll start by outlining my views, and then I guess Kevin is going to come back. So I don't like feminism. I don't like modern feminism because with it debate or discussion on. I think.
Hello.
Sorry, it was feedback. I was getting feedback. I've sorted it. So my position on this is that feminism comes with a lot of ideological baggage. So in many ways it seems to mimic a religion. In some respects, there are sort of doctrines, things like the concept of privilege, which doesn't seem to be based on any empirical evidence, but it just seems to be sort of, if you have this certain level of privilege, then your right to speak out is reduced. That's something I don't like, the idea of having to check your privilege. Now, I know people are going to say this isn't all feminists, but this is the sort of feminism that I'm arguing against. And it's the sort of feminism that I think
silent.
Have I gone silent? Can you hear me now? Is this audible? Can you hear me now? I can't hear you. This is. We did actually do a mic test. We did actually do a mic test before the debate, and it worked fine. So I'm not sure. Can you not hear me at all? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? I know my microphone is working. I can see. Can you say something so I know that you're there? I think what you need to do is, because sorry about this. For some reason he can't hear me, so he's going to just rejoin, and I think that will probably sort out the problems. Sorry about this. We did actually do a mic test before, so I'm not really sure why this is happening now. Are you? Is that you? Yeah. Again, I'm really sorry about this. I don't really know what's caused this. We did do a mic test before, so can you hear me now? Am I audible now? Okay. Well, I think what I'll do is I'll try and rejoin my Okay, I'm going to rejoin now and see if that works. Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Am I audible now? Wasn't it? You can hear me now. Can you say something? Because I can't hear you.
Well, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Right, yes. There we go. Apologies to everybody.
Oh, okay. So I think we can finally hear each other now. So
You can.
okay. So what I was saying was that actually I don't. Okay, I don't have a button now where I can stop. Anyway, anyway, what I was saying was that the reason I'm not a big fan of feminism is because it comes with a lot of ideological baggage, such as the whole check your privilege thing. The idea that some people have a bigger right to speak than others. Secondly, I guess the assumption that affirmative action is a good idea. Another thing I don't like is I guess the idea of equality of outcome over equality of opportunity, and these things are sort of more assumed and based on any sort of empirical evidence. Now, I don't like the comeback, this is not feminism, because these are things that the vast majority of people who identify as feminists believe in. So this is the sort of thing that I am very much against. So that's my piece.
Yeah. I think you've got a certain point in the sense that certain feminists are do tend to overstate the importance of privilege when it comes to allowance, or not even allowance to speak, but in terms of the weight in which that opinion is held. I think some people do go too far with that. But when I talk about privilege, especially as a white, straight, heterosexual, cisgendered man, I'm not in the business of saying my opinion doesn't matter or that anyone's opinion does matter. It's that you have to take into account someone's privilege when they're discussing the maintenance or the upkeep of a system that they benefit from. It's in the same way that when a politician talks in favour of a certain business, it's important to realise if they're getting paid by that business. It's a conflict of interest in essence, is what's being said there. So it's not, for me, it's not a matter of saying that a white person can't speak on behalf of or toward an issue to do with ethnic minorities or whatever. It's that if you say, oh, this issue doesn't, look with the Black Lives Matter people, and white people saying, well, all lives matter. Essentially, what you're saying there is that we shouldn't ever focus on a specific issue. And when I say, or when feminists say check your privilege, in that instance, it's saying be aware of the fact that your view may be coloured by the fact that you're not in the position that those minorities are in, if that makes sense. So it's not saying your opinion doesn't matter. It's essentially trying to get people to understand that their opinion is shaped by who they are.
Sorry, can I just very quickly join under a different account, because I'm worried that I'll actually get booted automatically by the system if I stay in this account. So I'm unfortunately, I'll come back to you in a sec, but I think I've very briefly got to rejoin.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, sorry to everyone who's listening who technical issues. And
Sorry, it was just to stop me from getting booted, which I think would have happened if I hadn't have. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. Hopefully this is the last of the technical problems.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess what you're basically saying is that experience helps. If you have an experience in a particular issue, then you're more likely to be informed on that issue.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not something I disagree with. I think the problem is, I mean, in the Black Lives Matter thing, I believe someone actually got kicked out just because they were white, for example.
Well, I've not heard of that specific instance, but clearly that's racist nonsense, isn't it?
Well, yes, exactly, and I think part of the broader implications of this is for example, people. I've heard the saying a lot. There's no such thing as reverse racism, and this might be a rather extreme view, but even to me, the idea that reverse racism is a concept seems rather counterintuitive. I mean, racism is, to me, is simply discriminating or falsely judging someone on the basis of their skin color alone. So the idea that for example, a lot of this kind of thing that you would see is a black person saying that you can't be racist against white people, for example. What would you say to that?
Well, yeah, I agree in a sense that I don't particularly like the term reverse racism, and often it's used as a sort of essentially a fucking whinge. It's someone moaning, in essence. But ultimately, yes, racism is racism. But the one area in which it can be useful in a sense is that in differentiating between what is the predominant type of racism in the Western world, which is usually, although not specifically, certainly in America, say, the most powerful group against a lesser powerful group. And so in that sense, if you want to say that that's racism, and then defining reverse racism as precisely that makes sense in terms of differentiating powers within different types of bigotry within power structures. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter, because essentially it's racism is racism, isn't it? I don't know if I've made any sense there, by the way, but I was trying to basically make the point that it can be helpful, that those kind of terminologies can be helpful in terms of differentiating between different types of racism, but ultimately racism is racism.
I mean, a sort of I guess I mean, let's look at an example where oppression does exist. My go-to example is always North Korea, because I think it's the best example of oppression on the modern planet. And what we have is a privileged class of a very few that rules over an underprivileged class of a very many. So what I don't understand is, I mean, to me, this is oppression. We have a small number of people, the North Korean elite, ruling over the whole of North Korea, and the people, the average people in North Korea are very underprivileged. To me, that makes sense. But when I see people applying this sort of logic to a Western culture, such as Western Europe, Northern Europe, or indeed America or Canada, I'm at a bit of a loss here, because I don't see this. I mean, there's no law that disadvantages women over men, in for example, or black people over white people, even though there may have been in the past. There certainly isn't today. So I don't really see why this sort of language is being used at all.
Well, obviously, North Korea is an extreme example of oppression. It's probably, like you say, it's probably the main or most black and white, obvious, straightforward version of oppression. But that doesn't mean that other less oppressive things aren't in themselves oppression. In the Western world, there are laws in place, obviously, like you say, to deal with what were situations in the past where either women or ethnic minorities or homosexuals or whatever were under the law seen as essentially second-class citizens, or in some cases not citizens at all. But when oppression is often less formal than the very brutal North Korean dictatorship, and also it's more directed than the North Korean dictatorship, because the North Koreans are essentially, like you say, it's a very small minority of people oppressing everyone, regardless of race, sex, sexuality, whatever. That it's a sort of essentially an indiscriminate oppression, whereas in the Western world it's much more informal and yet much more directed, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean,
because it's less formalized now, so it's not that it's just the powerful against the not powerful. No, it's more of a societal structuring rather than a legal downtreading, if that makes sense.
So can you explain to me then, for example, if I was one of these considered to be an underprivileged groups, how would I be disadvantaged? Because the way I see it is that when you take into account the sort of identity politics, you're actually more advantaged. People will do anything. For example, if a company has a white man apply and a black woman who's maybe homosexual, the company would much rather employ the black woman because it would give them a lot of kudos. So what I'm interested to know is how, in practice, how does this so-called oppression manifest itself in the Western country?
For instance, the way in which white police forces in America, and it's obviously quite high profile in recent times, have shot dead and brutalized a number of black people in America, and the majority of the media has only focused, or not only focused, of course, but has tended to focus on the black people getting pissed off about that rather than the actual crime itself, and essentially apologizing for that crime. So in essence, the black people are told, well, if you get angry at something for which you should absolutely rightly be angry, you're a thug. And so essentially it's treading down or punching down to people in already pretty impoverished circumstances often.
I mean, what I see is actually the media. I mean, disregarding the more extreme like Fox News. What I see is the media simply saying that it's a tragedy whoever is killed. I mean, America has a huge problem with its police system. I mean, I'm sure you have the same perspective as I do, being from the UK. We both know that how our police force is a much better situation than the American police force, which is very heavily militarized. What I see is not so much the media diminishing that these things have happened, but simply saying that it's not really that much to do with race. It's more a case of the problem of the American police force being, for example, overly militarized.
Well, for a start off, I think to dismiss Fox News as extreme is, I think, would be politically astute, but ultimately they are the most highly rated of the cable news networks. So clearly they are a very culturally significant group, and they aren't just punching down, they're fucking dropping bombs down, in essence, onto a black culture, essentially saying, oh, it doesn't matter that X, Y, and Z person got shot to death or choked to death. I mean, they're open about it, but the rest of the media are, in essence, playing the same game, it seems to me. I don't think, as much as they'll pay lip service to, oh, what a tragedy, they don't mind showing fucking endless looped footage of riots constantly, regardless of what caused those riots.
I mean, I'm just interested to know on a broader sense how. Let's look at Fox News then. How something like Fox News, the so-called fair and balanced, obviously no one believes. I mean, Fox News. By the way, is one of the most. I mean, it might be believed by a lot of people, but it's also heavily ridiculed. I don't understand how simply the existence of something like Fox News disadvantages people.
Just a quick aside before I actually answer the point directly. To any Americans listening, Quantum is himself, I think he would describe himself as a conservative by and large, a small C conservative.
I mean, in the British context, certainly not in an American context.
No, that's what I mean. This is how even British conservatives describe Fox News. Just to put that in context for Americans, it's seen as a fucking farce, basically, in Britain. Even by the British right, don't fucking trust Fox News. Or maybe we're just fucking commies, who knows? I forgot what the fucking point was now. I got so wrapped up taking the piss out of Fox News, I've totally forgotten what the point you made. Oh, how the existence of Fox News.
I merely sort of made the point that let's concede that there are biased news sources like Fox News. I'm just wondering how the existence of very politically motivated and often inaccurate news sources like Fox News significantly disadvantages, or as we used the word earlier, oppresses people. I mean,
well, it obviously has a significant cultural impact in the sense that it allows entitled white people to feel even more entitled, often quite rich, straight white, the kind of the actually privileged people in society. It also allows politicians who either actively wish to discriminate against black people or effectively don't really give a fuck either way whether black people are discriminated against to apply laws and amendments to laws which allow that to take place. It allows police forces cover in order to continue the brutalizing and murder of black people, and indeed of white people for that matter. And so in essence, when it comes to practical outcomes, it means that those at the bottom keep getting fucked over by the same power structures, because Fox News is there It seems primarily to protect those power structures, and that's how oppression comes out of it ultimately.
I mean, I've looked at the statistics, and I don't actually see, when you take into account the population differences between Black Americans and white Americans, there doesn't really seem to be any significant difference between the number of brutalized Black Americans and the number of brutalized white Americans when you take into account the relative populations, and even less so when you take into account sort of the relative crime rates. And of course, the part of the issue here is that a lot of sort of Black Americans tend to be immigrants, and just by the virtue of being an immigrant, you're more likely.
No, most Black Americans aren't immigrants.
Well, they have a higher immigrant population than for example.
Well, very possibly, yeah. But most Black Americans are Americans as such.
Yeah, okay. But the point is, when you take into account things like the crime rates committed, and more especially the relative populations between white Americans and Black Americans, it doesn't seem to me that there's any genuine bias.
Well, no, it's not. Well, it's not just a matter of color, because this is to bring it back to the point you raised earlier about privilege. You can be an underprivileged white person. You can be a very poor homosexual Jewish white person or something. You know what I mean? You can be in an oppressed group as well as being white. And obviously there are a lot of, I mean, they're called rather horrifically trailer trash or white trash, right? People in America who are very poor and who are treated in much the same way by the police that the police treat poor Black people. You know, but the police are unlikely to brutalize Barack Obama as a rich black guy as they are to brutalize Billy Bob on his fucking, you know, in his tin shack. It's poverty is one of the leading indicators of a lack of privilege, and is also one of the leading indicators of high crime areas. And unfortunately, in America, Black people tend to be much poorer and therefore tend to be involved in more criminality. Because ultimately, it's the old one about, was it those who make peaceful change impossible make violent change inevitable. Those that make peaceful living impossible, the kind of ultimate sort of free marketeer bastards who have had too much free reign, I would argue, for large parts of the latter 20th century and early 21st century, have made a lot of poor people's lives impossible to make a peaceful living. They'll make a violent living because people aren't going to want to fucking starve to death. So if you don't offer them a constructive way out of poverty, they'll find a fucking other way.
Well, I mean, actually, I'm going to agree with the vast majority of that. And apart from the free marketeer stuff, I actually am a free marketeer bastard. But I don't want to go into that because I suspect that will lead to a whole new topic of conversation. But most of that I actually strongly agree with, which kind of surprises me because the sort of identity politics that I'm arguing against is not the sort of thing that you're saying. The sort of thing that a lot of people that identify as feminists will be saying is that men automatically have more privilege than women, for example, and that's another interesting point.
If you averaged it out, that would be the case. So if you averaged it out, that would be the case. An average woman would be less privileged than an average man. If you take apples with apples, if you took the most privileged man and the most privileged woman, the man would be more privileged. If you took the least privileged, that would be the case as well. But it's not that every man is more privileged than every woman. Clearly, like Angela Merkel, the president of Germany, is more privileged than me because she's incredibly rich and incredibly powerful, right? But that does not mean that women as a gender are more privileged than men.
I mean, for as an example, men are far more likely to be murdered, or robbed, or assaulted in the street. Don't you think?
Largely white men,
though. Argument against the idea that men are less privileged than women, because clearly I don't want to be murdered, but as a man, I'm more likely to be murdered.
Yeah, but as a man, you're far more likely to murder.
I know I'm more likely to murder, but I'm more likely to be murdered. I mean, I'm talking about the victims here. I'm more likely to be the victim of the crime. Yes, I'm more likely to be a criminal myself. That's definitely true. But I don't understand how that's relevant.
If it's men acting upon men, then essentially it's men that are dominating the culture, whether it be the murder or, well, not the murdered aren't controlling it, obviously, but it's it's men essentially running the show, whether it be on a formal level in Parliament, where you're vastly more likely to be a man if you're in Parliament, and you're vastly more likely to be a murderer if you're or more likely to be a man if you're a murderer.
Well, let's say you say that women average more privilege than men. So what I want to know is, let's look at the perpetrator side. How does it make men more privileged that there are more male murderers? I don't understand how more male murderers makes men more privileged.
I'm not arguing that actually is part of privilege, but I'm just saying, if you look at it from the perspective of who's wronging men, it's other men. I mean, I'm not arguing that that's a privilege. I'm just stating that as a societal fact. You know, it's not that women are harming men, therefore women are actually in control of things. It's men. Actually, a point that I don't know, you're not strictly speaking a men's rights activist. We discussed this before coming on air, everyone. But men's rights activists make the point about the draft, which obviously we don't have in Britain, but have had in the past. And virtually every draft has been all male in the history of mankind. But virtually all drafts that have ever been implemented have been implemented by vastly, if not entirely, male parliaments or male monarchies or whatever. And indeed enforced by male police forces and male army leaderships.
Yeah, but I mean, if we're talking about the concept of privilege, which you said we're talking about averaging out, then I'd much rather be a woman in that case. If we go back to let's go back to 1939. I'd much better off being a woman than being a man, because of course if I'm a man, I'm more likely to be killed. I'm more likely to suffer from the Spanish flu in France afterwards. You know, well, why would I? If I could choose, let's say I could choose it's 1939 and I can choose my gender, having full foresight of what's going to happen. I know that I have a maybe 10% chance of being killed as a man, and a significantly reduced chance of being killed as a woman. I would choose to be a woman. And why would someone choose to be a woman if, like you say, that on average you're more privileged as a man?
So the only fact, it isn't that the only factor is being murdered. Although I think worth bearing in mind that during the Blitz, if you're a woman, obviously the majority of people left in Britain obviously were women. You were significantly under threat constantly from being bombed. The black market meant that there was a huge crime, including rape of women during the time. There was economic hardship and all the rest of it. So clearly women at the time, it's not as if it was only men getting fucked over by the war. The war affected women enormously. And that's the thing you have to bear in mind. It's not just death that's the problem there. Women were, and indeed have been historically, less likely to die in wars as combatants, but actually since the industrialization of warfare, so it's basically the 20th century onwards, the civilian to military deaths has flipped, and it's now more likely nearly 90% of deaths in war are civilian, and only slightly over 10% are now military. So actually, if you live in a war zone, you're more likely to die as a civilian, and most civilians are women or children.
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, that might be the case in modern times. I'm not entirely sure because I haven't looked at the statistics on it. But in terms of my example, I don't think anyone's going to argue that despite how bad it was living in Brighty with the munitions factories and the economic hardships and so on, I don't think anyone's going to argue that it was worse there than it would have been on the front line in France.
Oh, no. Yeah, absolutely, yes. Yeah, go on.
I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that in 1939, I would have chosen, if I could have chosen my sex, I would have chosen to be a woman, simply because, I mean, ironically, I think women were more privileged because they were less likely to die. They were less likely to be in appalling circumstances. So this is just an example, but so I mean, I'm simply saying that it seems to me far more nuanced than the idea that men have always been. I mean, obviously there are circumstances where that's certainly true. You only have to look in, and I suspect this is why your modern example of a civilian death holds up. But you only have to look to the Middle East to find a really good example of where women are very much the underprivileged sex. You only have to look into the Middle East. The vast majority of the Middle East, that's certainly true. Ironically, it's not actually true in North Korea, bizarrely, which is another interesting thing. So what I'm saying is that it's far more nuanced than any of these sort of identity politics are suggesting. There are contextual times that you can look at where men have clearly been overprivileged on average, as you say, and women have clearly been overprivileged on average, as you say.
Yeah.
But if I look at a modern Western country today, I really struggle to put one sex over the other. At this stage, I think there are advantages of being a man, but there are also advantages of being a woman. And I wouldn't say in a modern Western society that either sex is particularly advantaged over the other.
Well, firstly, again, it's worth bearing in mind when you talk about being in the army or which is worse and all the rest of it, that it was only, this is where I think feminism is necessary, because it breaks down, or it's tempting to break down the gender roles, which do in some cases harm men as well. Because if you say that only men should serve in wars, as the virtually all male parliaments, and in fact mostly male parliaments throughout history have said, and therefore instituted all male drafts, you're more likely to die in the army, right? So that would be one thing I think that feminism can do to actually help men. In terms of the example you used of the Middle East, yes, clearly women are much more oppressed in the Middle East, but I think it's called the fallacy of relative privation, whereby you say, okay, well, it's much worse there, therefore essentially you should be fucking happy with everything the way it is now. And I'm paraphrasing to a degree there. I'm not saying that's exactly what you're saying, but that's how that fallacy is sort of generally ascribed. And in terms of not being able to put one above the other, I think you really only need look at and it's not just slight, it's not just like it's an anomaly, like it's 52% to 48%. Look at the vast overrepresentation of men in parliaments throughout the Western world. It's not, and I don't think you can point to one parliament where it's even close to parity. And boardrooms, CEOs of large companies, again throughout the army, because often you still have that patriarchal view of men being in the army and women not being allowed, especially in frontline positions. If you look at the fact that there are so few heads of state, and I know technically the Queen is the head of state in Britain, but that's not. She's a figurehead. The sort of de facto head of state is David Cameron, and that's the case essentially across the world. To say that you can't put one above the other, look at the numbers. The numbers aren't lying.
If we're going to look at outcome, then obviously I could immediately bring up the sort of the prison gap, as it were, but I'm not going to do that because for one major reason, and obviously with regards to prison, am I more likely going to choose a life where I might be paid slightly more over one where I'm more likely to go to prison? But fine, I'm not actually going to do that because there's a major assumption here, and I think this is another sort of tenet of this sort of political ideology, that these differences that you have just described are due to some sort of either societal or sexist type of attitudes. Why are we assuming that? Why are we discounting the possibility that these differences are due to simply the fact that we're sexually dimorphic species? I mean, men and women are physiologically, psychologically different. Why might it not be the case that simply men are more interested in taking these leadership roles than women, for example?
Well, firstly, and I don't wish to seem nitpicking at all. I genuinely don't. But it's not an assumption I'm making. It's and I don't think for most people's part it's an assumption. I think people have looked at the situation and analysed it and come to that conclusion. And I know that I'm not just picking up on semantics there. I thought it was worth distinguishing that. Now you mentioned, I think it's called evolutionary psychology, evo-psych. The idea that men are, and I understand sexual dimorphism certainly works on a physical level, but whether it works on a psychological level, I'm not entirely convinced that it's just down to that. Because, for instance, if it was just evolutionary as to why men want to go into these positions more than women, how do you explain the underrepresentation of ethnic minority men or gay men or atheist men throughout the Western world, who are, again, vastly underrepresented in parliaments and boardrooms and CEOs and so on?
Well, I mean, with regards to evolutionary psychology, I think you have to be careful here. One thing I see with people sort of taking a pop shot at it is they say, you know, they make ridiculous claims like women used to stay in the caves, men used to go out and hunt, and they then try to make simplistic comparisons based on that. But the thing is, evolution is really, really complicated. For example, the reason that giraffes have long necks is not actually to do with the giraffe trying to reach the higher trees, as was once thought. It's actually due to a sort of sexual selection type thing. So let's be first clear that evolutionary psychology is vastly complicated, and you can't necessarily take simple conclusions out of it. And by contrast, you can't mock it by trying to disparage against these sort of simplistic conclusions. So firstly, I'm not exactly sure why men, for example, are more interested in these sorts of choices. You could come up with some hypotheses based on evolutionary psychology, but again, I don't think that's too relevant to the debate. Simply the fact that these choices exist would be enough for me. And they've actually done studies on this sort of thing. So there are studies on this sort of thing, and you know, there are genuine differences between men and women psychologically. I mean, basically irrefutable differences. You know, even if you look at neurological differences, there are differences there as well.
Yeah, but my point is, I don't think the psychological differences are enough to explain it. Because, for instance, why is it that ethnic minority men seem to be either as or nearly as disproportionately underrepresented in those positions as well? Because clearly that isn't a psychological difference, because there's no psychological difference evolutionary wise between a black man and a white man. Clearly, I think there is a societal problem at work here, and that's where privilege, I think, is a thing, because white men are generally seen, generally pushed forward, generally told that, certainly in the Western world, that's the sort of positions they go for. And that's why people like Barack Obama is as an outlier, is a huge step forward, because it shows that actually black men can go and do those things as well. And that's why, but he is an outlier. You know, black men are disproportionately underrepresented, and that can't be just a psychological difference, because if we're going to go down that line, there is no psychological difference.
But you already said that yourself, that a large part of this can be explained by the fact that black people tend to be poorer than white people, and class differences play a massive role.
Well, exactly, but women tend to be poorer as well. So clearly, it's not just a psychological difference. There is a societal pressure, which means that these minorities, or in the case of women, obviously on a minority, the underprivileged groups are not represented in these ways. It's clearly not just a psychological difference. There is a problem in societies. It's
not the case though that women are a minority in the middle class. I mean, if you divide crudely, if you divide society into the working class and the middle class, it would be the case that people of ethnic minorities would tend to dominate the working class. But if you compare men and women, you would not expect to see more women in the working class than men. And the proportions would roughly be the same. You'd expect to see the same number of men and women in the working class, and the same number of men and women in the middle class. So this factor this factor that's playing a part in ethnic minorities, and I think that is partly due to immigration, because the immigrant population is going to be higher in ethnic minorities. And I think that does contribute to poverty, because naturally migrants are going to be poorer than non-migrants, and that just to me seems obvious. Whereas with men and women, it's not the case. The number of women in the middle class is about the same as the number of men in the middle class.
Okay, well, so how do you explain it then? Because if it's not, as I think we can concede, it's not entirely a psychological difference. If it's not an issue of poverty, why are women vastly underrepresented then?
Well, women aren't underrepresented in everything. I mean, there are. I mean, let's look at
in virtually all of the powerful, politically powerful, economically powerful, culturally powerful, societally powerful positions, they are vastly underrepresented.
But they're also underrepresented in the lowest of the sort of positions, like the most dangerous jobs. Like we've discussed the military, but it's not just the military; it's the heavily industrialized jobs, the jobs which pay at exactly the minimum wage, the jobs which are very dangerous. Women are also underrepresented here as well. So it's not just the most powerful; it's also the least powerful that women are underrepresented.
Okay, but why focus on the least powerful, in the sense that that's in essence not where the change is going to come first, if that makes sense? I think you need women in those leadership roles before you can have a societal, or you need a societal change to make that leadership role happen. And if we're going to open it up, we have to open it up to the top and the bottom. But ultimately, there's no one focusing on the bottom, is there? No one really cares for the most part. And trust me, I'm not fucking far off the bottom rung. I'm just, I'm enough to fucking scrape by. And yeah, women are underrepresented in those roles as well. And I'm more than happy for women to go into those roles. But I think it's more important that they go into the top roles as well.
I've already said that given that women are not underrepresented in the middle class, if a woman wants to apply for one of these prestigious roles, she's just as likely to be able to do it as a man. It's just the fact that less women simply do apply. The pool
yes, and this is my point. Let fewer women want to go into roles, especially in very high profile positions like CEOs of companies and indeed politicians, most likely, because the media treat them differently and the electorate treat them differently. You can see this in the way in which the attractiveness of women is played upon in the media in a way with top female politicians in a way that they do not do with men. Just being able to get to the basic starting point of how do we judge the effectiveness and the reliability of a politician, a woman has to look her best, whereas a man can essentially get away with, we were discussing before, Boris Johnson. If a woman went out with her hair as scruffy as Boris Johnson, she'd get torn to pieces.
Let's go with this line of reasoning rather than the sort of sexual dimorphism thing first. You're right. Women have the shortest stick in the sort of sexualization regard. No one is going to argue that men are more sexualized than women. That is true. But in every other regard, men have it worse. So for example, in a job situation, you are more likely to be aggressive towards another man. That's true. You're likely to get a worse deal, and people are more likely to think favourably of a female candidate. And with affirmative action, that's even more the case. Yes, women are sexualised more than men, and that is one conceivable disadvantage. But I don't think it squares against all the other disadvantages.
Well, in terms of when a woman gets angry, she will be dismissed by essentially saying, "Oh, she's on her period," in a way that you wouldn't. Well, obviously, you couldn't do with a man.
If a man, I don't know, gets angry, I mean, the whole thing tends to be quite brutal. I mean, perhaps even more so. I mean,
if a woman gets to the top of her industry, questions get asked. Oh, well, whose dick did she suck then to get to that position? In a way you would never do with a man.
I mean, I've had disparaging comments made against me all the time. I mean, they've never been of a sexual nature, which I think that the primary difference. The media, I think, treats men and women just as badly. The only difference is the way it treats them. So I think that the sort of aggressiveness is basically is if anything slightly more towards men. The only difference is that with women, it tends to be more focused on sexuality. I mean, sexuality is more likely to be a thing that's more attacked. It's like, the way I describe it as, if you want to look at the media as being this evil entity. I'm not sure that's right, but if you're a playground bully and you want to pick on someone, you pick on the thing that you think is going to make them respond the most. Now, with men overall, it tends to be various different things, and with women, it tends to be more about sexuality and appearance. But just because the types of, I don't know, bullying might not be the right word, but just because the types of bullying are different doesn't mean that women have it worse off. And I think actually the converse is true, simply because of the affirmative action thing, where any reasonable employer, just looking from a sort of looking from a selfish point of view, would much rather hire women because of the sort of kudos that they would get. The company would win all these kinds of awards. They'd probably get financial incentives as well.
Well, actually, there's an instance I was reading about quite recently of the a lot of, because of the fact that young women are more likely to get pregnant and therefore need time off to have birth and maternity leave. Companies are actually vastly reluctant to actually hire younger women on that basis.
That makes sense. That makes sense from a capitalist standpoint, doesn't it? It makes perfect sense.
But that's where, and dare say me and you will disagree, the absolute free market doesn't have the answers to humanity's needs, and that we need to step in and make that financial difference or to negate that financial difference, to allow an actual fair playing field.
If someone takes maternity leave, then they are going to be worth less than someone that doesn't, regardless of whether they're a man or a woman. They are going to be worth less. So why, if I was the owner of a small business, why would I want to pay someone on maternity leave more than they're worth? It just doesn't, financially, that makes no sense at all.
No, exactly. But my point is that we need. I'm starting from the basal assumption that there aren't any or aren't many antinatalists in the room and listening later on. We want the species to continue, and so ultimately we want parents to be fucking parents, ideally first and foremost. So what you need to do in that situation is you can't just say, oh, it's a financial necessity. What you need to do is to allow a fair playing field, because again, like you say, it's not a matter of equal outcome, it's equal opportunities. And a young woman who we want as a society to give birth and to continue the species, we have to not make it financially, not to financially penalise her for that. If that means giving, say, a tax break to a company that hires a woman between ages X and Y, that, to be decided, under closer scrutiny than just this hangout, in order to negate that financial difference and to make it financially not penalising to that company to hire that younger woman, because they can afford to replace her for however many months because of that tax break. That would be a way in which we would have could level that playing field.
Then you're putting the burden on the taxpayer, which might well be paid by a family, including women that are in the working class, and therefore we don't. I don't. Why should the taxpayer?
Well, yeah, but taxes are paid by everybody, and I've no problem with our taxes being used to level the playing field. I'd rather have that than massive tax breaks for rich people, which is unfortunately what the current government has been doing since it began.
The playing field is level. I mean,
No, it isn't. Companies are not hiring women specifically because they're young women. That is not a level playing field.
Whether or not you choose to get pregnant is a personal choice.
Yeah, but if every woman in the world made the personal choice not to get pregnant, the human race would die out. And that's where the free market does not meet the needs of humanity, because the needs of humanity are for humanity to continue.
I really don't understand this line of reasoning. If you're in charge of a small business and you want that small business to survive, and the same is, I guess, the same is true of the taxpayer. Why would you subsidize something that is simply worthless? It just for no reason other than
it's not worthless, because I would argue that the maintenance of humanity's presence here on Earth is the most worthy thing we can do. And so to allow women the freedom to do that whilst not being penalised for doing that, something which we require them to do, I think would be a absolutely brilliant use of the taxpayers' money, which we could fund very easily by cutting any number of extraneous government spendings.
But the thing is, it is true that taking maternity leave does generate less capital. So there is a capital gap. That's just true.
Raising children is a phenomenally expensive thing to do, but it's a thing we have to do. Just because something costs money does not mean inherently it's bad, if that makes sense. That's where, again, the free market is incompatible. The absolute free market is incompatible with humanity.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem reasonable. It doesn't seem reasonable to me to subsidize something just to make the playing field level when.
Did you not say you wanted equal opportunity, not equal outcome?
Yeah, equal opportunity.
So what's wrong with leveling the playing field?
Well, again, between men and women, the playing field is level. I mean, men, of course, continue.
It isn't, because it's not just that it harms their career in the short term to take time off to do something that humanity requires young women to have to do. Not individually, but as a collective, there has to be enough of them in order for us to survive as a species. But it hurts them down the line, because at the time they're taking off to raise children, which we need them to do, men are advancing in their careers, making business contacts, and rising up the ladder in a way that young women are not.
Okay. How about this? Okay, how about this then? Women live longer. They require less food. They require less water. Therefore, we should have a tax
on women simply because they are more resource intensive. Same reasoning. Same reasoning. It goes.
How are they resource? Hang on, but I don't understand that. If they're taking up less, why are they being taxed for that?
Women live longer. They require less food. They require less water, and of course, like you say that childbearing is necessary for the future of the human race. Well, what's more necessary for the future of the human race is food and water. So why should men have to pay the same amount of capital for food and water as women, given that they need more, and that's just a biological necessity?
But if then so right, they live longer, which is true, and they require less food.
Yeah, and of course, when they live, I mean, the extra 5 years that they're getting is going to be not economically useful years. It's going to be elderly women that the rest of the taxpayers having to support. So
everyone's fun. Yeah, but the point of that is it doesn't matter how long you live. If you've paid your taxes in, it doesn't really matter. You've paid your due. It's not that we say, oh, you're not economically. That's almost a. And I know you're playing a certain devil's advocate, but there's a certain unfortunate eugenics to that, isn't there? That it doesn't matter if you're unproductive in your later years because you've served your productive time, you've paid your due, and therefore you're entitled to a comfortable retirement. Regardless if you're a man who dies at 65 or a woman that dies at 70.
But I mean, why doesn't the same sort of reasoning apply to the pregnancy thing, to the maternity?
Because we require. It doesn't matter whether a man lives to 60 or a woman lives to 65 or whatever. We absolutely require women to do the job of child rearing because there's nothing you can do about that.
Yeah, and men, and we absolutely require men to eat and drink more than women simply to stay alive.
Well, often only because, well, they are physically larger, but often that gap could be shrunk if they were doing less physical jobs, for instance. Or,
but the average basal metabolic rate of men is going to be higher than women. So why? In everyday life, men have to drink more water and eat more food. So surely that's a disadvantage that, if we're going against the sort of free marketing principles, then why don't we have?
No, I'm not against any free market. I don't think that's the idea of starting from a position of how can we reduce government reach into private people's lives. But I'm suggesting that the absolute free marketeer, the kind of Ron Paul, regardless of what question you ask that fucking guy, his answer is always let the free market decide. That isn't compatible with humanity going forward. It just isn't. It never has been, and we don't live in an absolute free market now. I don't think we could. The kind of anarcho-capitalist, and I don't know if necessarily you should subscribe to that. But ultimately, even in your slightly odd devil's advocate approach to that, how would you even enforce that? I don't know, because if you're saying you tax food and water less, men and women live together, so how would you tax the water that goes into the houses of both men and women, which have a man and woman's tap? How would that even work?
I mean, are you seriously saying that this is a pragmatic concern? I mean, let's forget the pragmatics. In principle, would you be against this? In principle, let's waive the.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So in principle, you would actually be for a system where women are taxed more because they eat and.
No. I'm saying I'm very much against that, obviously, because I'm not fucking insane.
No, I mean, but again, why is this not the same style of reasoning as it would be for the maternity leave?
Well, no, I'm for maternity and paternity leave, but I'm suggesting that women do have to take, even if they don't want to take a single day off in maternity leave. You can't, a woman isn't going to be pregnant, give birth, and then be back at work in the afternoon. It's obviously a huge physical undertaking, and ideally, what we do want is both men and women, as maternity and paternity leave, to take care of the child in its formative years, ideally. Because that leads to better outcomes by and large for the child, which is better for society and better for productivity and tax and blah blah blah. But that shouldn't be punitive to the mother and father, and it is predominantly the mother that does that work, even in a slightly changed society we live in now. That it shouldn't be punitive to the mother, to her career and to her productivity and her advancement in her career to do the thing that we desperately need her as a species to do.
And I'm not actually against the concept of paternity leave. I'm fine with it. I think the thing I'm against is specifically trying to counterbalance the idea that women are perhaps slightly disadvantaged because they're more likely.
It's not just slightly disadvantaged; it's enormously disadvantaged. Because, like I say, it isn't just taking time off; it's the fact that they're hired less, or that people are reticent to hire them because of the financial risk. And during the time that they're raising children, which is often, this is one of the things that gets used to explain away any pay gap, is they say, well, women take time off to raise children. Well, why is that? Why are we financially penalising them for that? Why is that something that's held against them? Or, well, it doesn't matter. No, of course it matters. We need desperately as a species, in order for us to survive, for young women to take time off work to have and raise children. And that should not be financially penalising young women to do the thing we need them to do. We should be grateful and rewarding them for that.
I'm asking why you would be opposed to some other form of sex counterbalance that, like the example that I gave. I mean, I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem if for paternity leave. I don't have a problem with that. You know, I think it's very reasonable. But
you're raising the spectre of a problem that doesn't exist. That paying slightly more for food and water at the same rate, by the way, as women do, has clearly not held men back ever.
How do you know that? Maybe it has, and you just don't know because you're
suggesting the massive overrepresentation in Parliament should be more because of the slight financial penalisation of having to eat more food.
Well, I'm not saying it's necessarily slight, but I'm saying that okay, maybe it is. Maybe it is. I mean, we don't know exactly what the representation should be just by looking at the outcome. This is the point I'm saying. We don't know what the natural. Let's assume that there's no sexism of any kind, no psychological sexism. We don't know what the natural outcome is going to be, the natural sex bias. Perhaps it should be more. I don't know. This is not my suggestion here. I'm just using the sort of same logic here. You know, we don't know what the
I've raised a specific problem which is holding women back, and you've raised a specific problem that clearly hasn't held men back.
How do you know it hasn't held men back?
Okay, it hasn't held them back to any significant degree because they're still fucking running the world.
You don't know that. You don't know what the natural bias of sex would be.
Men have, by and large, always, but outside of, if we go back hundreds and hundreds of years with women dying in childbirth or whatever, by and large the problem you raise of men having to eat more and live shorter lives and all the rest of it has always been the case, right? And men have always run the world, so clearly it hasn't held them back. Clearly they've always run the shop. They used to an even larger extent, and they still run it vastly. You know, the majority of the world is now still run by men, so clearly it isn't a fucking issue. Whereas I've raised a specific issue and a specific way in which we might tackle that issue, and I think you're being a little pedantic.
The only reason that you're raising this issue in the first place is because of the difference in outcome. You don't know what the natural difference would be if there was. Let's say there's no sex.
Well, if you wish to just obfuscate and say, well, you don't know, that's fine, but that's not a productive discussion. None of us know 100%, do we? Of course not. But all I'm suggesting is that I think it's the very least a tad sexist to suggest that, or not just that, I would argue incorrect, because obviously, like I say, the underrepresentation of ethnic minority men and homosexual men, to suggest that it's just the way things are the way things they should be because of evolutionary psychology or because of sexual dimorphism, because clearly that isn't the case for ethnic minority and gay men, and they're just as, if not in some cases, less represented in these incredibly powerful positions.
Well, I mean, if I've already covered the ethnic minority, but let's say you're homosexual. How would your employer even know that if you don't declare it? I mean,
well, I'm not just talking about what when I mention these things, I mean specifically in those incredibly powerful positions. An employer wouldn't know it, but why should you have to hide it?
Well, I mean, when I'm applying for a job, I don't say that I'm heterosexual. Do you say that you're heterosexual when you apply for a job?
No, because people assume, because the vast majority of people are heterosexual, unless you state it otherwise, people will just think, oh, well, he's straight then. Because
why if like you say it's a handicap, then why would you deliberately handicap yourself? That doesn't make any sense.
Why should someone, like say for instance with politicians, a politician comes out and says that he or she is gay, that's headline news. They get a lot of pressure put on them. They get a lot of hate poured towards them from bigots. Why? But and that's clearly a fucking problem. And that means that unfortunately there are a lot of closeted, powerful people out there. I'm sure in sports and politics and economics and all the rest of it. But ultimately, that's clearly a societal problem because it means that gay people are less likely to come forward to those positions, and those that get there are having to live a lie.
I mean, of course, you get a lot of hate if you're homophobic as well. I mean, let's not say that you don't get hate for. I'm not advocating being a homophobe, but if you are a homophobe, you get.
Well, you're defending it on the same basis that I'm defending a human being's right to be naturally what they are. If that makes sense. Being a homophobe is a fucking choice in essence. You're deciding to be a prick to other people. Being homosexual is a natural part of someone's makeup. That's the difference.
But the point I was making is that pro-gay attitudes may get some hate, but anti-gay attitudes also get hate. Let's compare the magnitudes of hate. I don't think this is overly productive, and I don't think.
No, I'm not just the difference being essentially, and this is going to sound blunt and a bit crude, but ultimately, if you're a bigot and you get shouted at, that's your fucking fault. If you're gay and you get shouted at, that is not your fault.
Okay, I agree with that.
Yeah. So there's the difference. If you want to stand up in Parliament and say something anti-gay and you get pressure for it, fuck you. In essence, you get what you deserve in that case. If you're homosexual and you stand up and say I'm gay and people shout at you for it, that's wrong. And that's what does happen, unfortunately. And that's a societal problem, which is clearly holding gay men back, which means that it isn't just a matter of evolutionary psychology. Clearly, there are societal factors at play. And I think that's the case with women as well.
Well, I mean, can you demonstrate that this actually is a factor that's holding people back? I mean, again, in the vast majority of employments, you're not going to be declaring your sexual orientation.
No, I can't obviously point you to a specific example of a human being who has said, I didn't go into politics because I was gay. But clearly, a young gay man or woman watching the way in which homosexual politicians or homosexual sports stars are dealt with in that very crude and despicable manner by some people, and a slightly coy sort of borderline homophobia by certain parts of the liberal media as well, will look at that and think, oh fuck it, I just don't want to be involved in that. It's not essentially you're sending out a message, it's not for you.
Yeah, okay. I mean,
and I think that happens to a degree with women as well.
How I mean, do you think that psychology doesn't play any part at all?
No, I think it probably does play a certain part. I'm not denying that evolutionary psychology has its potential part to play, but like I say, it clearly can't just be that.
Okay, I mean, well, I've looked at studies involving the wage gap, and I was often quoted as being 23% or something, isn't it? And this is a figure that's quoted an awful lot. And now it seems to me that if all this was true and we're just looking at as these societal factors as being a partial cause of this gap, then the actual 23% statistic would not be quoted anyway, because it's pointless to just quote a statistic that does include the sort of biological factors as well. And obviously, as that I've looked at, you can explain the vast majority of it. At least 2/3 of it can be easily explained with various different dimorphic factors. The other 33% are harder to explain. But of course, being unknown doesn't mean it's caused by sexism. Now, my problem here is that this sort of whole ideology that focuses on applying an artificial force to try and push the pendulum back to where you think it should go. Given that we don't even know where the pendulum is supposed to go in the first place, which is something that you said, why not instigate a completely meritocratic system where, for example, you blind a candidate so you can't see their ethnicity or their sex and so on? Why don't we do that? And the idea of meritocratic concept is something that is opposed by most feminists, for example.
Well, I don't know that in practice you could completely blind that. I don't think that's. It's certainly in a lot of cases, I don't think that's practical. But the reason I'm against an absolute meritocracy in an unfair society, which is as we live in, if we lived in a 100% fair society, a meritocracy would be brilliant. But unfortunately, when you apply a meritocratic structure to an unfair society, what you get is a status quo. What you get is exactly the same people already in power remaining in power in perpetuity, and that is not acceptable to me.
Do you? I mean, look at the power structures over the last 50 years. Would you not say that they've changed?
Yeah, because society has forced them to change. They haven't changed. They haven't changed because it's a meritocracy. Look at the cabinet, the British cabinet. Would they have looked out of place 200 years ago?
Margaret Thatcher,
Margaret
Thatcher, first female prime minister. She got the place based on her merit, not because of any affirmative action.
Well, women in Parliament, which allowed her even to take up her fucking seat, was done that way. The kind of, even if you a point you made earlier about you don't like modern feminism, I don't think anyone can realistically dislike first wave feminism because it allowed any of this change to take place.
Giving everyone the vote seems perfectly consistent with a meritocratic system to me.
Well, exactly, yeah. But my point is, if we'd have just allowed the status quo to bumble along as it was, we would be far behind where we are now.
The status quo, I mean, as I'm sure you would agree, was counterbalanced against women, let's say 100 years ago. So the fact that the fact that we're instigating a system where everyone has equal opportunity is not so much pushing the pendulum back with an artificial force; it's just stopping the pendulum from swinging at all. Well,
when you say swinging back, it was never. Essentially, the idea of there even being a fucking pendulum, in essence, is a relatively new thing. The idea that women are essentially to be listened to in any way is a relatively new thing. And so, like you say, I don't know exactly where the pendulum should rest, but I know it's nowhere near that now, if that makes sense.
I don't really see strong evidence for this. I mean, you know, if we look in places like India that have a lot of strong artificial force, for example, in India there's massive pressure towards women getting jobs in engineering, massive pressures, and indeed the proportion of men to women in engineering positions at both universities and in jobs is very, very high in India. It's probably among the highest in the world. Yet India has nowhere near as good gender equality as many Western places. I mean, the interesting thing is, if you look at somewhere like Norway, which has is which is one of the most gender egalitarian places in the world, there are far less women that are going to do engineering in Norway than there are in India.
Again, I think this is an instance of not comparing like with like to a degree, especially with India. India's in terms of it being a free market, free state, is a very new country in that sense. So I don't know the outcome of how many women are doing STEM jobs or engineering jobs or whatever, or going into engineering courses, can be directly comparable to essentially anywhere else in the world, because of the vast numbers of people there, the government, as you say, the government intervention in those sorts of things, and the fact that it's essentially a new capitalist country in that sense, because it was obviously it was only in the 40s, 50s that it gained independence, and even then it followed a path of socialism for a number of years before any kind of, as we now know it, free market existed there. And obviously there's still huge poverty there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. The only point I'm trying to make is that you know, if you apply a large artificial force, you can get a lot of women into representation, but that's not necessarily the natural order of things that would happen if there was no degree of sexual discrimination at all.
Okay, yeah, but why are you arguing that the natural order of things is fair or good or even desirable?
Because it's a complete. The natural order would be a system where everyone has equal opportunity. There's no discrimination based on people's sex or gender. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Why no one want that?
Well, actually, no. You said the natural order of things. If that were the case, why has that never existed?
Because
if that were the natural order, why is there no point in history you can point to where that's ever been close to a thing?
well, I mean, when I say natural order, I mean in the sense how things would be if there was no element of
If
discrimination.
we artificially forced a system upon society that has never previously existed, that doesn't seem in the slightest bit natural to me, and I'm fine with that. But you're the one that's arguing against us forcing the situation.
You can't. I honestly don't think the best way to achieve this natural equilibrium is to apply random forces to it. I mean, like you said, you don't know exactly how large.
You say natural equilibrium. It's never existed. It's not natural. I'm arguing that we've progressed beyond the natural to the point where we can force an unnatural 100% equilibrium on society, or equilibrium of opportunity on society, which would lead to a vastly more fair and balanced society. But if you're going to say meritocracy is brilliant, yes, but you have to allow a meritocracy at the very start point. And if you're not going to do that, if you're going to say we're going to start meritocracy in the workplace, well, how do you expect some poor kid who's barely been to school in his life to compete with someone who's been to the fucking richest school in the world?
I mean, that's a slightly different argument. That's less about meritocracy in terms of every gender, every race, every sex having equal opportunity. That's more about the opportunity of individuals that were born with more wealth, which I think is a different argument.
It isn't, because we were talking about privilege, if you remember. That's how we started talking about it. And privilege isn't just the colour of skin. It's essentially what you're born with, in essence, and what develops. Someone who, like, say, Donald Trump, arguably the most privileged human being ever, would never be in any kind of position that he's in if he wasn't born with fuck tons of money and white and straight.
Well, I don't think the fact that he's white and straight has that much to do with it. I think if
he were black and gay, the Republican Party would not be taking him as seriously as they take him now.
Well, that's the Republican Party, though, isn't it? I mean, the Republican Party.
And that's the party that he's currently the front runner to be the presidential nomination for.
I mean, I'm not going to defend the Republican Party.
As depressing as that is as a fact, it is a fact, you know.
Yeah, okay, fine, it's a fact. But I mean, America, in terms of the political systems across the Western world, America is a slight outlier in that respect. I mean, you know,
is it? Again, I'll point you.
I'm going to vote Democrat anyway, but
yeah, but I'll point you to the British cabinet, which is made up by vastly white, vastly straight, vastly men.
Well, I mean, I've already said that. I think I've already commented on some of the reasons that I think that will be. I mean, also the other reason for this is going to be that there's some degree of lag, but I don't think, you know, basically this you know, to use the pendulum analogy again, you know, if you want to have a pendulum in equilibrium, stop applying forces to it. You know, just stop applying any sort of force to it and wait for things to work. It might take 50 years before, you know, it might take 50 years for all the sort of middle-aged people that are currently alive to die and for, you know, the equilibrium to be reached. But that's the best way of doing it, and it's probably the quickest way of doing it.
But Q, if I can call you Q, you say it'll eventually reach its thing. Did humanity not try that for thousands of years?
No, I don't think it did. And we never had the luxury of trying that for thousands of years, because I mean, you know, the way that we lived for thousands of years was pretty brutal. I wouldn't suggest that this was necessarily a good mechanism to survive. We currently have the luxury based on the fact that we have a civilization where the apex predator and so on. This is something that we have the luxury to implement now. I'm not saying that this would have been a luxury when we were still hunter gatherers. I mean, when we were hunter-gatherers, it made perfect sense for the women to stay back in the caves and for the men to go out and hunt. That made perfect sense back when we were hunter-gatherers. It doesn't make any sense now. You know, the only reason I'm arguing for meritocracy is because we have a civilization that and the technology that would allow us as a species to be able to survive. It makes sense that it didn't work. It didn't work thousands.
I'm in favour of meritocracy in general, but like I say, you're applying a system of fairness to a system that's inherently unfair, and you're going to get massively unfair outcomes from that.
No, I disagree. If you apply fairness to an unfair system, the system will gradually get fairer. It might not happen immediately, but it will happen.
Okay, but you're essentially you're applying an outward force, which you've argued vociferously against, throughout this discussion, and also you're arguing from a position which seems very odd to me as a free market, from your position as a free market capitalist. You're arguing on the basis that you think people won't try and corrupt. People who are powerful are going to wish to remain powerful. And so I don't think that in the current situation you're in, where economics is, or the dollar is king, the rich people are inherently not going to take advantage of any system you put in place.
Sorry, I'm just phone's ringing out. Be a sec.
Yeah.
Sorry, the phone was just ringing. Okay. I mean, I mean, the whole wealth gap is something slightly different, and that of course is unfortunately the virtue by which you're born. Of course, it's not the only thing that disadvantages you by random chance, but it is one of those things. But with regards to things like with regards to things like gender and ethnicity, I think the best way of dealing with that is just apply no force at all. I don't understand why you're saying that this is going to, I already talked about the fact that there's a lag. People do die eventually. This does happen. So yes, there is going to be a lag, but
this is my problem I have with a lot of anti-feminists. Essentially, the argument is shut up and it'll get better, and I don't see that having that kind of laissez-faire approach has ever helped in the past. Whereas I can point you to any number of fucking huge list of things where taking control of a situation and saying, no, this is fucked up, let's change this and let's apply an external force to what was the natural order of things, has made society better and progressed us to a point where, like you say, now we do have the luxuries to be able to say, no, fuck the natural order, that we want fairness.
I don't think we've ever really done that. We've simply removed external forces that already existed. For example, giving women the vote wasn't an external force. It was just an example of removing an external force that already existed. One that said, for completely arbitrary reasons that the arbitrary is the important word here. For completely arbitrary reasons, we're not going to let women vote. We're only going to let men vote. That, to me, saying that anyone can vote is an example of removing an external force, not an example of adding one.
Your argument of external force falls down when it comes to, say, democracy. Is democracy not inherently an external force?
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, again, for the vast majority of human history, we've not had democracies. And in fact, for the majority of people who are alive today, they don't live in democracies. Certainly in, say, China and Africa, large parts of Central and South America. They don't live in proper actual functioning democracies anyway. And so ultimately the imposition of essentially a kind of formalized mob rule is a very new thing and an external force which has helped societies in the West grow.
I'm not arguing against I'm not arguing against anything that we created that was artificial. I mean, all I mean by external force is removing any bias towards a particular individual for completely arbitrary reasons.
Yeah, well, I agree with you on that basis. Yeah. So we can.
I don't see how democracy.
We can have, okay, let's have an 80% inheritance tax then.
Well,
because that's arbitrary. Which set of testicles and which vagina you came out of was arbitrary. So let's have an 80% inheritance tax.
You have to catch me up on this?
Basically, my point is, it seems odd that you as a free marketeer would concede the point, because who you are born to, what family you are born to, is entirely fucking random. You could be born a Chinese peasant or Donald Trump and anywhere in between on the economic scale, right? So inheriting money is not, you're not working for that. That you came by that via random means. Therefore, that money should be taken off you and redistributed more fairly. Yeah. Well,
your IQ is also randomly assigned. No one.
Yeah,
I mean, I think if everyone had the choice, they would all be geniuses, right? I mean, it's someone that has an IQ of 70 and who is probably not going to be able to make a good living for themselves. Someone that's more likely to be able to, someone that's more likely to be a criminal just because they have a low IQ. That's not their fault, is it? Should people with an IQ?
No, I'm not saying, but I'm not arguing for a 100% inheritance tax. I'm saying I don't want to make rich people poor. I just want a fairer society. And surely, like you say, it's arbitrary. So why would you be against it?
Well, the IQ example was just illustrating how complete fairness would be naive. But with regards to inheritance tax, I'm not actually
arguing for complete fairness.
I'm not actually against the concept of inheritance tax. I would be against the concept of an 80% inheritance tax, but that's for purely.
That seems rather arbitrary. Why have you decided that?
That's the reason. The reason is completely irrelevant to this conversation. It's a matter of well, it's a matter of pragmatism and the economics of having a tax that high. I don't think the economics. I don't think the 80% tax would work, but that's a pragmatic reason. It's not an ideological reason. So it's not really relevant.
I'm poking a bit of fun now. I had you on the rope, so I thought I'll just poke now. You didn't need to answer that. I was only joking. I was putting up a hypothetical on the basis that that is arbitrary. Basically, the idea of who you were born to is arbitrary as well.
I mean, yeah, I agree with that, but you know, there's the who you're born to is assigned randomly, right? You know, it's completely random. Whereas discriminating on the basis of someone's color, it's not like if I go out into the street and for every person I come across, I roll dice, and if the dice is 6, I employ them, and I have this system. I don't think anyone's really going. I mean, people might think I'm a weirdo, but I don't think I'm going to get a load of feminists coming up and saying how unfair I'm being to everyone, but going around rolling dice and deciding completely randomly whether people should be employed by me. I don't think I would actually get a lot of hate for doing that. But I would get a lot of hate if I went out into the street and said, right, I'm only employing white people, and rightly so. But there's a clear difference there between something that's entirely random and discriminating on the basis of something like skin color, which is just bloody arbitrary. There's no reason for it.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm not going to. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with what you just said, to be honest. But I was, like I say, I was just. I was playing a silly little. I was amusing myself at your expense, and I apologise for that.
That's fine. I mean, the thing about my economic views. Like I said, I'm quite right wing in the UK, but I'm not right wing in the GOP sense. But my economic views, my sort of free market, capitalist type views. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist, because obviously anarchy is stupid. It just doesn't work. But the reason that I'm pro-free market is for purely pragmatic reasons. I guess some people put it like this: I have the ideology of a leftist, but the pragmatism of someone that's on the right. I simply don't think that very left-wing economics is effective, and this is purely my pragmatism coming out here. So I don't think it was all that relevant to the discussion that we were having previous, which was a purely ideological type discussion about these external forces. The inheritance thing is a little bit different. We can discuss that if you like, and because I think we disagree on this as well.
Well, I was just going to sort of generally raise the spectre. How do you feel about Jeremy Corbyn?
I think he's a bit of a nutter, if I'm honest. I think Jeremy
By all means, elaborate.
Sorry?
By all means, elaborate.
Well, I'm just thinking about where to go with this, because if I could take some very easy pot shots about Jeremy Corbyn, particularly on the sort of very dubious views he has about Sinn Féin and the IRA, but that's more about Jeremy Corbyn as a person. With regards to his economics, which is, I think, a perhaps more interesting discussion, because it's more about the idea rather than the person. With regards to his economics, he's extremely socialist, and I'm very much against that. Because
I don't know. You could say extremely socialist. He's a socialist, yes. I don't think he's, like, for instance, he's kept Charles Faulkner in his cabinet. He's appointed Andy Burnham. John McDonnell as his shadow chancellor is a socialist as well. But I don't think you could say extremely socialist. I think there are people to the
right. He's the most socialist leader of the Labour Party since Michael Foot, certainly.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. But that's not hard to do. You could find pretty centrist people that would be true of as well, to be honest.
Well, maybe. I mean, the point is, I mean, okay, that you could probably get more socialist than Jeremy Corbyn, but I mean, I would, you know,
That's my problem with it. I like a lot of his, like you say, outside of some of the more extreme personal shit he's got involved in, and there's a slightly nasty whiff of certain anti-Semitism amongst people who have in the past spoken on, we've spoken on a stage with some pretty nasty individuals, even if it's for a cause you agree with, like the anti-war stuff. So there's a nasty sort of whiff there. But if we ignore that and just focus on his, like you said, the economics or whatever, I actually quite like the guy, but I don't think he can win a general election.
No, I mean, if I would have voted for Jeremy Corbyn on the basis that I knew it would cause Labour to lose, but
there was a certain thought, because I mean this is going to get slightly boring, I suppose, for a lot of people, but the affiliate members were allowed to join the Labour Party, weren't they? To try and sort of drive up numbers and all the rest of it. There was certainly a conspiracy theory that a lot of Tories were joining on that basis, because you could join for like a 6-month thing to become an affiliate and vote, and they all voted for Jeremy Corbyn just to fuck the Labour Party up.
I don't think it was a conspiracy theory. That wasn't a conspiracy theory. That was actually happening. I mean, the Daily Telegraph was actually advocating that people do that. That was genuinely happening.
Well, no, but I mean in terms of significant numbers thereof. I imagine there are always going to be certain bits of jiggery-pokery, but in terms of was it 500,000 people joined or something?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it was big numbers. I mean, the worst thing about the whole thing was that it wasn't well thought out. Which I'm going to start attacking the Labour Party a lot now, because I don't think the Labour Party thinks anything through it. But the electoral system that the Labour Party had was really shoddily organised, and I think the worst thing was not so much that inevitably people on the right were going to take advantage of this. I mean, that this was a lack of foresight on Labour's part. But I think the worst thing about it is what Harriet Harman tried to do in damage control by, it almost seemed arbitrarily, banning people from voting who were actually Labour Party members, because they were worried that they weren't part of the Labour Party's ethos, right? Ironically, I think that actually harmed Jeremy Corbyn, what Harriet Harman did. It didn't cause him to lose, of course. He still won. But I think ironically,
it's worth bearing in mind actually that not only did he win, he won in a fucking huge landslide. So I don't think any of those individual factors would have stopped. Just on pure mathematics, he won outright. He has a mandate. I don't think he hasn't tricked anyone in that respect.
I suspect though, if Harriet Harman hadn't done what I would consider to be something very, very undemocratic. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was out saying that it was the most. It was a triumph for democracy, which is ridiculous, because I think the whole thing was a shambles. I think I think calling it democratic couldn't be further from the truth. But what I'm saying is that I think if Harriet Harman hadn't have been trying to mess with an already messed up system, Jeremy Corbyn would have won by an even larger margin. I mean, I think.
In terms of him coming out and saying it's a victory for democracy, every leader, fucking Robert Mugabe says that. Everyone says that. I don't think it's not surprising.
Yeah, maybe not, but I still thought it was very amusing that he said that, when it clearly was not a triumph for democracy. It was almost as bad as Farage and resigning after you lost.
Yeah, that was glorious. Yeah, I'm going, and then 2 weeks later he was back.
I mean, it was almost as bad as that, basically. Well, you could calling it democratic couldn't have been further from the truth. I mean, the Tory leadership election is going to be far more democratic, and I say that as someone that knows that George Osborne is going to be trying to manipulate everyone into voting for him.
Yeah, well, but ultimately, but as much as the system might have been fucked up, I think ultimately the candidate who was going to win won. So in that sense, actually, in a way, in a very, very bizarre way, it actually was a triumph for democracy, because it shows even if you design a shit system, the people still get the candidate they wanted. So in a kind of slapstick sense, it actually does sort of back up democracy in an awful way.
And only because he won by such a large margin. I mean, if he'd, I mean, actually, the Labour Party has a weird voting system, don't they? It's not first past the post. It's something else. So I'm not quite sure how this would work. But let's assume. I don't know. Let's say Liz Kendall came a very, very close second, a really close second, to the point where it was maybe a few percent that the difference between them. I think a legal challenge there would have been. I think there would have definitely been cause for a legal challenge. Now the only reason is because he won by such a bloody large margin. That
Well, exactly. Yeah. Well, it was in recent times almost unprecedented because they do it on a 1-2 system. You get, I believe, you vote for your first candidate and then a second choice candidate, and then but he won on the first choice. You didn't even have to go to the second round in essence, which is a very new thing in the Labour Party. So which clearly shows he does have a mandate from the, which is slightly annoying that the right wing of the party have acted in such a way, because ultimately the party membership did speak, and he does have a mandate. So it's basically suck it up, guys. You know.
Well, I'm wondering. I mean, I'm wondering exactly what the sort of turnout statistics were, because I suspect that the people that voted for Jeremy Corbyn probably came out in larger numbers than the sort of Blairites. And in any case, I think it's going to destroy Labour. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting consequences here. I think firstly, the Green Party is finished. The Green Party no longer has a reason to exist now Corbyn's around, because the Green Party was always sort of the socialist party of the UK. No longer necessary. The Green Party is going to lose loads of votes now to Labour. The SNP has also got to be kept on its toes, because I think actually Jeremy Corbyn's Labour is actually now left with the SNP. So the SNP's got to watch out. The only thing that the SNP has really got going for it is the independent stuff, which I think is really going to be hammered home now. And I think the SNP is really going to be worried now. So they're going to have to really hammer the independents home. And ironically, not ironically, but I think the interesting implications of this is that the SNP will try and very quickly bring another referendum for Scottish independence, just to sort of put a line between the Labour Party and the SNP, because the SNP realises that, oh shit, the Corbyn's Labour is a real threat to us. So the only way that we can rile up our voters against Labour is by asking for another referendum, because we know that Labour, that's the only.
But I think they genuinely would have a legitimate argument for another referendum if Britain were to leave the EU, because they voted for staying with as a member of the EU, and so I think they would have an actual legitimate legal reason to say, okay, now we're not a part of the same country that we voted to remain a part of. Let's have another one. And I think, given another 5 years of Tory rule, I think Scotland will have had enough at that point and say, fuck it, and go for independence. So that is, ironically, in one sense, that even regardless of whether Corbyn has his impact in Scotland or not, I think Scotland, by the end of the next Parliament, won't be a member of, or at least has a very strong chance that going into the following Parliament won't be a part of Britain.
I mean, I possibly agree with that. I mean, I think the results of the referendum are going to be interesting. I don't really know what's going to happen to UKIP if we win. I think we will win. I mean, at least I hope we win, because I'm very Eurosceptic.
I think though, just because of the momentum, the numbers are pretty close at the moment, but the momentum is just anti-EU all the way. I mean, it's a shame in a sense, because I think economically, I don't figure that Britain works well leaving the EU, to be honest. But maybe I'm wrong on that respect. But either way, I think to go back to fucking pendulums, the pendulum is swinging too hard to stop now.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting is that the neo-liberals, which is the right wing of the UK, and the hard left, the socialists, probably both agree on the EU, because essentially it boils down to this: neoliberals hate crony capitalism, and socialists just hate all forms of capitalism. So both groups are going to be hating the EU.
Well, it's not just that. I think a lot of old school trade union people don't like the imposition of rules from elsewhere. Oh
yeah, I mean that's a big factor, of course. I mean, and also it's not just the economy; it's also the there's the whole migration debate as well, and the fact that the EU is a bureaucratic mess. You know, it's you can hardly call the EU.
That's what makes it difficult to defend Britain's part in Europe, because I'm pro-Europe, but I'm not pro-EU, in the sense that the EU is a fucking disaster zone, frankly, in terms of the economics of it. Trying to force one currency across all of those countries was always going to be fucking ruinous. I don't see that anyone thought that was going to be successful in the short term, at least.
I think this might be the one thing that we completely agree on. Yeah,
from the referendum, I will vote to remain, but I will do it slightly begrudgingly, because I want us to be part of a European Union, but not this European Union. It's just it's a like you say, it's a bureaucratic nightmare. Unfortunately, the French and Germans seem to be slightly dictatorial in their way of dealing with it. But ultimately, I think Britain, even with this EU, is still financially better off. To be honest,
I'm not convinced. I think. First of all, I don't think we should underestimate how much we lose simply through the bureaucracy. And then secondly, I think crony capitalism is only a step away from corporatism. And there's a world out there. We need to be more freely trading with other parts of the world, not just the EU. And frankly, if we did leave the EU, what could they do to stop us? They couldn't. There's no way that the likes of Germany and France would stop trading with us. And if they instead decided to put up tariffs, it would actually ironically harm them more than it's harming us, given how much we.
Yeah, but on a slightly tangential point, what I hate is the undemocratic way in which the current EU does its thing. Seeing Herman Van Rompuy sat at the fucking United Nations representing me. No cunt ever voted for him, outside of Belgium, obviously. No one voted for him to be in that position. So why the fuck does he dare speak on my behalf?
Well, there you go. Maybe you should vote UKIP.
No, fuck UKIP. Fuck UKIP right off. UKIP are any party that has to put on their website, we are a non-racist libertarian party. I'm sorry, at that point, you're protesting too hard, lads.
Wow.
I'm sorry.
I mean, to be fair, the media were pretty awful towards UKIP. I mean, you never heard about all the Labour Conservative gaffes.
No, you don't. Fucking media was sucking UKIP dick all throughout that election. They loved a bit of UKIP.
Well, maybe the
racist UKIP came out with all the time. Sorry, go on.
Well, the Daily Express, yes, but apart from the Daily Express,
the Daily Mail and the Sun, they all the BBC. Every time I turned on the BBC News, there was some fucking UKIP story happening. They were every fucking it was just insatiable. And I wouldn't mind, but no, I knew they weren't going to win any fucking seats. Of course they were. They didn't have any fucking outside of the southeast. They don't have any fucking actual structured party. They can't win enough votes to win enough seats for them to be a matter. Whereas other parties, like you say, like the Green Party or whatever, who pre-Corbyn absolutely did have a certain party base, got more or have more legitimacy in that sense, you know.
UKIP got more votes than the Greens ever managed. They also got.
Yeah, no, absolutely they did. Yeah, but at least in part because they were given huge amounts of free publicity on national TV and newspapers, which they absolutely undeserved given their paltry number of seats that they've ever won in any election.
It was bad publicity though. None of it was positive. Certainly from the BBC.
None of it was positive.
No, none of it was positive.
Joking?
No.
Oh, yeah, that's absurd.
Obviously, I'm not saying literally none of it was positive, but in the broad scheme of things, it was not positive coverage.
It was pretty positive for the most part, I would suggest. I think they were given much longer shrift than mainstream politicians would have been. Far more.
Oh yeah, but I mean, every time.
Imagine if a leading member of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party had come out and said that immigrants need to go back to bongo land. They'd have been torn to fucking shreds. But they would it was treated as a kind of whimsical little joke because a UKIP bloke did it.
Well, I mean that was Godfrey Bloom, wasn't it? And he was just talking about the foreign aid thing. But I mean, for example, if you look at the most famous gaffe that came from UKIP was the hurricanes cause. Our bad weather is caused by homosexuality, and the guy that said that was a former Conservative member for 30 years, and no one batted an eyelid when he was a Tory. But when he joined UKIP, everyone lost their shit. And to UKIP's credit, they kicked him out pretty damn quickly. I mean.
Yeah, but UKIP do this thing. They did it with Christopher Monckton as well. You know
he's climate change denying muppet, Christopher Monckton.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but he was rehired by the party after going on the Alex Jones show and saying that Barack Obama was born in Kenya and was a Muslim. But they rehired the guy. The media died down.
I don't agree with everything they do. I mean, I think the reason I voted UKIP. I mean, I suspect I don't. I mean, when you look at the sort of people that voted UKIP, there were a surprising number that formally voted the Lib Dems, which is again sort of my sort of demographic. Because if I hadn't voted UKIP, I would have voted Lib Dem. And I suspect. So
After the last government that the Lib Dems were a part, I don't know why anyone would have voted Lib Dem in that last election. They broke every promise they fucking
I was very sorry for the Lib Dems. I very much like Nick Clegg. I mean, Nick Clegg was one of my favourite.
I say fuck the Lib Dems because ultimately they built their popularity on the back of left-wing votes. They got a lot of students, a lot of some old Labour types who joined their cause and all the rest of it, and then they went and joined the most right-wing fucking government for a generation, and were happy to do so, and they got destroyed, and frankly, rightly so.
All right, well, that's probably why I like them, and you don't. I mean,
but talking about democracy, if you have promised people a certain thing, like for instance the tuition fees, they said they get rid of them, and they tripled them as soon as they got into government because they totally shat on the people who voted for them. That's undemocratic, I would suggest. No one voted for that last government, and it was the most radical government in a generation, and that was entirely undemocratic. Had no mandate for it.
No, I wouldn't necessarily say it was undemocratic, but I would agree that it was fucking stupid and the biggest mistake that the Lib Dems have arguably ever made, and one that was essentially committing political suicide, and one that I mean, the tuition fee thing was absolutely ridiculous because the main stupid thing about it is that the Lib Dems never had any obligation to vote against fees. I mean, it was actually, and this, I'm not entirely sure this is true, but I think it might be true, but apparently there was a private conversation between George Osborne and Nick Clegg, and he told Nick Clegg that he didn't have to vote he didn't have to vote in favour of tuition fees. The Lib Dems were actually free to vote against tuition fees, like they said in their manifesto. And apparently Nick Clegg took that as a double bluff and said, "Well, I'm not listening to a Conservative politician," and voted against tuition fees. But no. Nick Clegg made a massive blunder there. Not all the Lib Dems voted against it. Some voted neutrally. I don't think any actually voted against tuition fees. But the whole point was it was a complete shooting in the foot situation because none of the Lib Dems were ever politically obliged to vote against tuition fees, but they did it anyway. So I would just call it a stupendous act of utter stupidity more than anything else. It wasn't. They could have completely avoided that situation. I don't understand why they did that. And this is coming from someone that actually, I'm actually okay with the student fees thing. But I think the Lib Dems really decapitated themselves by doing that.
Yeah, and it's a shame because all the hard work that was done by people like Paddy Ashdown and not Nigel Kennedy, Charles Kennedy, and even to a degree Min Campbell, was totally wiped away in one election, basically, because of the pathetic lust for power in Nick Clegg, basically, and Danny Alexander, I suppose.
I think the Lib Dems will make a resurgence. I mean, the whole Jeremy Corbyn thing means that people are going to the sort of Blairites of the Labour Party are now going to start to vote Lib Dem. I mean, what other parties?
I think there are fewer Blairites than a lot of people think. I think a lot of the people who essentially acted as Blairites for a number of years were just desperate to get rid of the Tories. I don't think Blair is, in terms of his personal following, either in Parliament or elsewhere, is as big as he ever was shown to be, if that makes sense. People were happy to follow him because he was successful. In terms of his politics, I don't think there are that many around.
I mean, I will. You can. I mean, I actually hate Tony Blair mostly because of what he did after Prime Minister with the bloody peace envoy stuff. I mean, you could hardly call Tony Blair a peace. But yeah. You know, well, the one thing that the Israelis and the Palestinians can probably agree with is that Tony is in their hatred for Tony Blair. But I think when he actually won his election, it was won by the largest majority since the Second World War, or something ridiculous like that. Certainly in terms of the Labour government.
Oh God, yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. Look, it was phenomenally successful, and I think that's what kept the left wing of that party in check for so long, because they were happy to go along with him, even though they didn't like him, on the basis that he was winning. And now the Labour Party, with essentially the same politician. Oh well, Ed Miliband was a bit different, but he wasn't that fucking different. Not as much as the press like to say that he was. They've been happy. They've been discontented with that, and essentially have now gone fuck it and gone with the most left wing option they could have, really.
Yeah, and it's going to be like Michael Foot and Margaret Thatcher all over again. And I
Possibly so, yes, possibly so. We shall have to wait and see.
mean, I'm happy about the whole situation. I mean, no, it's not gonna hurt me. I mean, unless in the very small chance that actually Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, in which case I think.
Well, the one thing I will say is good in general is that finally, there's a progressive pushback, but more importantly than that, give him his due, regardless of whether you like his politics or not. He's a forthright, honest guy.
Yeah, I will give you that.
And he's been in Parliament for a long time, and his MP's expenses were probably arguably one of the best of the lot of them. It was incredibly honourable.
I think I would describe Jeremy Corbyn as the only socialist ever to not drink champagne.
No, you're talking to one right now, my man.
Okay. The second only socialist ever to not drink champagne.
Yeah, well, maybe so. But anyway, as cordial as it's been, I sort of need to go and get ready to go and work for the filthy capitalist pig dogs.
So it's been a fun conversation. What I'll do is if you look in the YouTube video afterwards, there'll be a little thing saying remix this video, so you can, if you want, put it on your channel as well. But yeah, it's been a really fun chat.
Yeah, thanks, man.
We've disagreed on nearly everything, but at least it's been done cordially.
Absolutely, yeah.
Anyway, I'll see you later then.
Okay, so roll on out.